Can you comment on the power of the network effect? You've touched upon it when you were talking about the barter system where objects inherently had some value in them, and then we moved into signed notes that were transfer of value, representative of value in a way. So most of the money today is digital. If you really break those numbers down in online banking, they'll just be bits, it'll just be ones and zeros, which we can argue don't hold much value. And even if you take a $100 bill today, if you actually break it down into its components, it will not, most likely won't value up to $100 itself. So can you comment on how strong this contract we have signed between us, or this mutual agreement that we have signed, and at any point, if anyone violates this contract that we signed, that, oh, this $100 bill doesn't represent $100, then everything falls apart. Are you surprised at all that this has lasted so long, especially in this world where countries, companies, even two people find it very hard to agree on anything?
Sure. So let's divide your question into like two pieces. Let's address the network effect first. So for our viewers, a network effect is simply a question of how sustainable or how truthful a system of this representation is. And a network effect is simply the amplification or the multiple that's added to it with the increase in user base. So the more users using it generally equates to a positive network effect because the sustainable truth or the sustainable source of that effect increases and amplifies. And then is the communications effect, which one person tells another person, and that increases the node where this transfers from like a singular object to like a multiple use case scenario. And so network effects have two main features, one of which is called a direct network effect and the other one being an indirect network effect. A direct network effect is, think of it as like social media. The more people use it, the more people accept it, the more people understand it, and the more people get a benefit out of it. So if I'm on a social media and I want to connect to you, but you're not on it, it sort of breaks the idea of why am I even on social media if the only one thing I want to do is connect with you. Whereas if you're on it as well, we can use this as sort of a medium creation and you can utilize it for a variety of different reasons. The indirect network effect is sort of slightly more tangential, and that is generally when two groups or more than two groups of users use a particular instance. And the network effect is when one group increases in number, the second group benefits from that. And you can think of it most recently or most noticeably in rideshare or a marketplace. So the network effect there is when the number of drivers and the number of riders increases, it benefits the other group. The increase in number of riders will help the drivers. Increase in number of drivers will help the number of users. And that's generally the case with content creation as well. I prefer using websites that have more content. And so the more developers they have, the more content they create. The more content they create, the more users they get. And then it sort of feeds back into this circular loop where the more users they have, now they can hire more developers and more content creators. And this sort of is this network round circle effect. Now to your second part of the question, which we touched upon slightly, but is this idea of what happens if the truth or the truth breaks down or some fallacy comes into play and people stop understanding what the reality is. And this has happened in the past as well with the Bretton Woods system. So what happened was the American dollar back in the 1930s was pegged to an ounce of gold. So every ounce of gold was worth $35. And over time, people realized that maybe the government has issued more money than the amount of gold it has under it. So if I were to go to the government and give my $35, I wouldn't get an ounce of gold. And this distrust was created in the economy once. And so we can explore this idea through a historic element that we just described. And this happened into the 60s where over time, the US government realized that they've had too many suitors come in, ask for the gold in return, and take away so that the government can take their money away. And eventually, the US government realized very shortly after that they did not have the right amount of gold to back the instrument of money that they just created. Hence, the system was about to fall apart. There are a few notions of what happened after, but the most commonly understood theory was the Bretton Woods system was abolished and the US dollar then became a self-standing source of money. Now it has its pros and cons. The pros are, now you're not backed by any physical object because most physical objects in the world are finite. They are either some sort of resource that has to be mined, or they are some sort of concept which is in some sense created by another human. or is some sort of natural element. The natural element we described, the human element is, again, in a sense, also restricted because you need human power and human competition to create these elements. And so the US dollar moving away from this backing of physical commodities was helpful in that sense. But then it comes back to the question is, what if I stop accepting the US dollar? Which is when, and we can dive a little bit more into this as well, is when the centralization of authority comes into play. So if you and I believe in a court system, why do we not believe in another central authority that guarantees that this fiat money is going to be accepted, that we talked about earlier, and that everyone will believe in this sort of fictitious concept? And then coming back to the network effect, if they can guarantee one person to believe it, they can expand that idea from one person to a second person. Now you have two people telling two other people about it. And this sort of pyramid scheme just grows larger and larger, but it is built upon a central authority.
A lot of things to unpack there, Richin. But this might sound slightly paradoxical. I apologize for jumping around, but do you think it's possible to have a universal, decentralized form of payments that doesn't rely on the network effect?
That's a good question. And that's sort of the research that's being conducted in the present world as well, where how does this decentralization of money come to play when there is no network effect? If there is not enough user base, then how would you have this like worldwide concept? And so in my opinion, to have this world accepting phenomena or this worldwide concept, you need a user base to accept it. And by definition, if there is a user base to accept it, you do get a network effect that builds upon the user base that exists in the past. So the question then comes down to is how do you get the first user or the first acceptance into the scheme? And that's more of a philosophical question will it be conducted through some sort of a decentral distributed technology? Which is interesting because you and I can have different nodes. We can have equal computational power, or we can have some sort of equal regulation into this node. So the decision making is distributed. And then finally, we can have some sort of a majority system where if enough users like us accept on some sort of decision right, and we can increase the threshold for certain other reasons. So you need, say, more than 51% of the nodes to agree upon a decision, then you can have a decision made. And so the question then is, does this actually work? And how does the network effect not play into this? Because you and I are understanding of this decision-making process. But then if you have a third person join in, then what happens to the decision-making process? And that's what the distributed ledger sort of helps with, is you can keep adding nodes without reducing the effect of each of the nodes because you have shared distribution rights, and then you have shared computational powers. But it sort of fails upon one main idea is how do you have nodes attached, or how do you bring people into this like distributed system? You need to create some understanding and some belief in the system before people buy into the idea. And that's sort of the harder concept there. So the network effect is helpful to bring in initial user base. And then after you have an initial user base, the expansion is much, much quicker.